Hi, welcome back to the Joy of Tennis Teaching. For those of you who've observed the background of my video, that is not a corpse of a dog. That is my boy Sherlock enjoying a little mid-morning nap. Um, so please don't accuse me of trying to pad views by including a dead dog in my video. Today I want to talk about something that I think is very, very important. If you remember back to one of the earlier videos, I mentioned something that we call the lot theory. Yes, Sherlock is alive and well. Thank you for helping me out there, Sherlock. Um, anyway, the lot theory stood for listen, observe, teach. And I gave a brief explanation of it at the time, but I'm going to come back to it a number of times throughout this video series because I think it's one of the most important tools that a tennis teaching professional can have in their toolbox to achieve better results with their students and to be much, much more effective as a tennis teacher. Today we're going to focus in on the L for listening. I think listening is probably the most important of the three stages because if you do a great job in the listening phase, it really sets the other two phases up for success. If you really listen to the student, you know what to look at and to look for in the observe stage. If you do a great job in the observe phase and listening, you can put those two things together, what the student is thinking and what you see the student is doing, and then you can do a great job in making the decision on what to teach. And we're going to give a couple of examples, good and bad, of this later on in the video. When I was a young man at the University of Massachusetts, my freshman year in college, I took a Psychology 101 course. Unfortunately, I didn't take this course because of the great insight that I had on how important psychology would be later in my career and life. But I took the course because, to be honest, all the freshmen found out and knew that this was a class you could sign up for, attend the first lecture, and pretty much just get a passing grade without having to attend the course. Not the greatest educational reason, but that's where I was. So anyway, I signed up for the Psychology 101. I showed up for the opening lecture, which was held in a large lecture hall, and there were hundreds and hundreds of students there. And we all went through the registration process and made sure that we were counted as attending this first lecture. And the professor came out on stage and he talked about listening. He opened the lecture by saying, I know that this will be the last time I see many of you, so I want to do this lecture today on something that will be very valuable in your life, even if you've never become a psychology major. And he did a brilliant lecture on listening. To be honest, it's probably one of the more memorable things from my academic career at UMass. There were many great insights into listening that have flashed back to me during the many years since I attended that lecture. One of the reasons that I decided to do this on listening today is I was going through my files and I came across an article called Listening and so let me get this right because I don't want to give you the wrong thing. The Tennis Professional and the Art of Listening by Jorge Andrew. And Jorge is one of the most accomplished and talented tennis professionals that I've ever met in my long career. And Jorge did this brilliant article that really he adapted from another article. I don't know if it was a business or a psychology magazine. And it listed a number of things that you could focus on to improve your listening skills. And Jorge explained why that was so important for a tennis professional. But before I get to the two or three parts of the article that I thought were very valuable for me, I just want to make another point about listening. I read in a business magazine not too long ago that in American business today, mistakes made because of miscommunication due to poor listening account for billions and billions of dollars of losses each year. There was one anecdote that I'll never forget. It talked about a trucking company in Boston, Massachusetts, and there was a small shipment that needed to go to Portland, Maine. And because of some miscommunication between the person making the order and the dispatcher, or the dispatcher and the driver, nobody could really identify where the miscommunication happened. But the driver ended up taking the shipment to Portland, Oregon, completely on the other side of the United States. A 2-hour delivery ended up taking 3 or 4 days, and well, actually 6 to 8 days with bringing it back. And think of all of the cost and gas and time for the driver, and the business loss. And I don't even know if the product was perishable or not. So it really, that little anecdote has stuck with me on how a tiny listening mistake can lead to a huge error that can be very, very costly. And for us as tennis teaching professionals, I think this is really important too, because we have that limited amount of time with our students to make an impact. And if we don't do a good job with listening, then it can be a really fruitless lesson. So let me go into the things from the article that Jorge published that I thought were really, really valuable. My favorite point was ask questions, which I've talked about a lot in the whole listening phase. You have to ask the questions to elicit the information you need from the student on what to teach. But they took it a bit further in this article, which I thought was brilliant. It says, ask questions, but leave time to respond for the person that you're speaking to. Leaving that time for them to respond is so important. Because the biggest mistake most of us make when we're listening is we don't listen to the response. We hear the words, and immediately we are jumping to responding to their response. So learning to listen properly means allowing the person that you're talking to time to respond to your questions. Don't look for your response back to them. Really listen and absorb and make sure you understand the response. And that leads to the second point that I found very important in this article, and it was don't interrupt. Often we interrupt just out of impatience because we aren't really listening to that response. We hear some words, they trigger a thought in our head, and we're so eager to get that thought out there that we jump right in and interrupt. This is why I think the LOT theory is so brilliant, because if you know that you're going to observe, it reduces that need to respond so quickly. It allows you to listen to what's being said and then think about, okay, how am I going to check this? The student tells me their problem is their backhand. How am I going to observe whether the problem is the transition from the forehand to backhand or the backhand itself? And by not interrupting, by knowing that you've got some more time with the observe phase, I think it allows you to listen better. And the third part of the article that I found very brilliant was actually point number 1. It said, look at the student or look at the person with interest, and you listen with your eyes as much as you do with your ears. For many years in PBI, everybody would agree that the greatest listener in the company was Christine Dyer, our company's executive vice president. When you spoke to Chris looked at you in such a way that you knew you were being heard. Chris, if you see this video or if somebody passes this video on to you, I don't know, maybe you were singing songs in your head, but you certainly never let us feel that. When Chris Dyer listened to you, she looked at you in such a way that you felt heard. And I think that's a really important thing for you to understand as a tennis teaching professional. Look at your students. That will help to relax them and get them to tell you more about what they understand and believe about their tennis game. So listen, observe, teach is such a powerful tool to have, and it all begins with that first phase, the listening phase. And I'm going to tell a quick story. Yes, for gift Searles out there, Unky Dan is going to go to story time. When I was the director of training for PBI, one of the biggest parts of the training program was having the new professionals teach practice lessons that we would observe and evaluate and discuss after the lessons. And it was not the most comfortable feeling in the world when you were a new professional to have one or two or three people observing your lesson and you knew they were going to critique it. So there was already a high level of anxiety, and anxiety definitely doesn't increase your listening skills. So I can remember this one young professional asked the student a great question. He said, "What would you like to work on?" And the student said, "The serve." So the professional said, "Great. Well, what do you think is the problem with your serve?" Again, a brilliant question. And the student said, "Well, I think the problem is my toss." And he was starting to reply, but there was no space for more response. The coach heard the word toss and jumped right in and says, "I can teach the toss," and immediately started talking about the toss and teaching the toss and going on and on about it. And for those who know me, my pet peeve is that on the serve, the problem is never the toss. So right away, I'm writing in red ink on the evaluation form. But the real important part of it was the pro didn't listen to the complete answer, didn't really understand why the student thought it was the toss, and never observed any serves to evaluate for themselves. Could the problem have been something else, which it turns out it was. The student actually didn't have a toss problem at all. So probably the first 20, 25 minutes of the lesson was pretty much wasted because of poor listening, no observation, and jumping to a conclusion. So make sure when you get out there that you take your time. Don't feel the pressure of, I'm being paid to teach. I need to teach right away. You're being paid to teach because you have a lot of knowledge that the student doesn't have. So how to best get to the part of your knowledge that's the most helpful to the student will be dependent on how well you perform, listen, observe, and then teach. And finally, I'll close with a quote that Peter Burwash must have said hundreds of times in my PBI career. And it's, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should use them in that ratio. Or if we fail to use them in that ratio exactly, we should fail in the direction of listening more and speaking even less. Because if you're speaking, you aren't learning. And if you're listening, you are learning. So I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope that you'll be a little bit more aware of how good are your listening skills and that you'll use some of these techniques to look at your student intently, to give them time to respond fully, to not interrupt. And if you can do these things, if you can become a better listener, you will definitely become a better teaching professional. Thanks so much for participating in the joy of tennis teaching, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future.